The night Cade Mobility unveiled its most ambitious electric vehicle, the renovated Union Hall looked like something out of a magazine spread. Champagne caught the light. Investors moved through the crowd in tailored suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Cameras were everywhere. Then Bennett Raines walked in. He came through the main entrance in a worn canvas jacket with a grease stain across the left shoulder, steel-toed boots that had seen 1,000 better days, and hands that still smelled faintly of engine oil no matter how long he'd scrubbed them. Someone near the bar actually laughed. A woman in a backless gown leaned toward her companion and whispered something behind her champagne flute. Serena Cade saw him from across the room. She was 31 years old, CEO of one of the fastest-growing automotive groups in the country, and she had spent 6 months making sure this night looked exactly right. She took one look at the grease on his hands, said 3 words to her event director, and had Bennett escorted toward the exit before he made it 10 feet past the entrance. Bennett set his invitation card on the counter without a word and walked away. But when Gideon Cade arrived later that evening and saw that name on the card, the color drained from his face. If you've ever been judged before anyone bothered to learn your name, stay with this one. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. Stories like this are what this channel is built on. Harborvale was the kind of town that didn't make the news unless something went wrong. It sat on the northern coast, caught between a stretch of gray water and a highway that most people used to drive through rather than stop at. The marina had seen better decades. The diner on Clement Street still had a handwritten menu on a chalkboard. And on the eastern edge of town, past the old rail yard and the storage units that had been half empty since the mill closed, sat a low concrete building with a hand-painted sign above the roll-up door: Raines, Craft, and Motorworks. Bennett Raines had owned the garage for 11 years. He was 39, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of hands that told the whole story of a man's life, scarred at the knuckles, permanently stained at the creases, steady in a way that only came from years of careful work. He didn't talk much. The people who knew him well said he communicated better through what he fixed than what he said, and that was probably true. He hadn't always been a small-town mechanic. He'd studied mechanical engineering at State, spent 4 years afterward working in drivetrain system design for a mid-sized automotive firm in Detroit. He was good at it, genuinely good, the kind of engineer other engineers asked questions to. But then his marriage fell apart, and his wife left, and there was a 9-year-old girl who needed a father who came home at the same time every night, instead of one who was always one deadline away from being present. So Bennett packed up, came back to the coast, bought the garage from a retiring widower who cried a little when he handed over the keys, and started over. In the world of classic car restoration, his name carried weight. The 1968 Mercury Cougar he'd spent the last 3 years rebuilding, every gasket replaced, every chrome piece hand-polished. The original 428 engine, rebuilt from a seized block, had earned quiet admiration from collectors up and down the coast. When Cade Mobility reached out about featuring it at their Aurora launch event under the theme From Mechanical Legacy to Electric Future, Bennett had agreed. Not for the attention, he just thought the car deserved to be seen. Lena Raines was 9 years old and had strong opinions about everything. She did her homework at a folding table near the garage's side window, close enough to the work floor that she could hear her father's radio and smell the oil, but far enough that she wasn't technically in the way. She'd grown up in that garage the way other kids grew up in kitchens. It was where the important conversations happened, where she learned how to read silences, how to tell when her father was focused versus when he was worried, how to hand him a tool before he asked for it. Lena didn't perform emotions. She observed things and reported them with the bluntness of someone who hadn't yet learned that honesty was supposed to be softened. When something was wrong, she said so. When something was unfair, she named it. And she had a particular talent for asking the one question that no adult in the room was willing to ask out loud. She was, in every practical sense, the person who knew Bennett best. Serena Cade had been running Cade Mobility Group for 2 years, and she was exhausted in a way she would never admit to anyone. She was 31. She had an MBA from Wharton, a track record of restructuring 2 divisions that had been bleeding money, and a reputation in the industry for being precise, prepared, and impossible to rattle. The press called her composed. Her board called her decisive. The people who worked directly under her knew she arrived before anyone else and left after everyone had gone home. What nobody said out loud, what everyone thought, was that she'd gotten the job because her father built the company. Serena knew they thought it. She thought about it every time she walked into a room and watched people recalibrate their expressions. It had made her harder than she needed to be. It had made her faster, to cut quicker, to dismiss anything that threatened the image she'd worked so relentlessly to construct. She told herself it was discipline. Some nights, she wasn't sure. The Aurora launch was supposed to be her statement. 6 months of preparation, every detail locked down. The Union Hall venue, the press list, the lighting design, the carefully curated guest list of investors, journalists, and industry figures. She had approved every name on that list herself. Gideon Cade was 67 and had recently been persuaded by his cardiologist to slow down. He'd spent 40 years building Cade Mobility from a 2-bay repair shop into a national automotive group, and the transition from founder to figurehead had not been graceful. He still showed up to every major event. He still had opinions about everything. But he'd learned slowly to let Serena run the room. He came from the floor. That was the thing about Gideon that his daughter sometimes forgot. He'd spent his 20s doing other people's repairs for $8 an hour, learning every system from the inside out before he ever touched a balance sheet. He had a different instinct about people because of it. He could tell the difference between someone who understood machines and someone who only understood talking about them. He was running late the night of the Aurora launch. His heart had been uncooperative that week, and his driver had taken the long route on doctor's orders. Dorian Sutter had been Cade Mobility's communications director for 22 years. He was 42, trim, always in a dark suit, and operated with the quiet efficiency of a man who had made himself indispensable by knowing exactly where every body was buried. He had built the Cade Mobility brand from the ground up, the visual language, the press, relationships, the careful narrative of innovation and legacy that had turned a regional auto group into a name people recognized. He believed with complete sincerity that image was substance, that how a company appeared was inseparable from what it was. He had watched brands collapse not because their products failed, but because their stories lost coherence. And he had spent 2 decades making sure that would never happen to Cade Mobility. When Bennett Raines walked into the Union Hall that night, Dorian didn't see a man. He saw a variable, an uncontrolled element in a tightly managed environment. He leaned toward Serena, kept his voice low, and said what he always said when something didn't fit the frame. "We need to move him out before anyone gets a photo." He wasn't cruel about it. He was practical. That, in some ways, was worse. It had been a Tuesday when Bennett loaded the Mercury Cougar onto the trailer. Lena had stood in the garage doorway watching him strap it down, arms crossed, wearing a look of exaggerated suspicion. "You're sure these people deserve it?" she asked. Bennett had tightened the last strap and looked at her over his shoulder. "It's just a display, kid." "That's not what I asked." He hadn't answered. He'd just climbed into the truck. But on the drive down the coast toward the city, he'd thought about it. He didn't need the room to be impressed. He just wanted the car to be seen by people who understood what it had taken every late night, every sourced part, every hour of patient work that turned something dead back into something alive. That was enough. That had always been enough for Bennett. He didn't know yet that by the time the night was over, none of it would have gone the way either of them expected. The call came in at 6:47 p.m., 40 minutes before Bennett was supposed to walk through the Union Hall doors. He was on Route 9, dressed as well as he ever dressed. Clean dark jeans, a button-down he'd ironed twice because Lena had told him the first attempt looked like he'd slept in it. When his phone buzzed through the truck speakers, a Harborvale number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail. The voice on the other end belonged to a school bus driver named Roy, 63 years old, pulled over on the shoulder of the Harbor Bridge overpass, with a full bus of kids and an engine that had quit cold. Roy had already called dispatch. Dispatch was sending someone, but the estimate was 45 minutes, and the shoulder was narrow and the kids were restless. And Roy's voice had the particular quality of a man trying very hard not to sound scared. Bennett looked at the clock on the dashboard. He looked at the exit for the city coming up on his right. He took the Harbor Bridge exit instead. The problem turned out to be a failed fuel relay, a 15-minute fix if you had the right tools and knew where to look. Bennett had both. He worked under the hood in the dark, headlights from passing cars sweeping over him, while the kids pressed their faces against the bus windows, and a girl in the third row asked loudly whether the mechanic was a superhero. Roy stood beside him, holding a flashlight and apologizing repeatedly for the inconvenience. "Stop apologizing," Bennett said, not unkindly. "Hand me the other relay in the red case." By the time the bus engine turned over, his jacket had a grease stripe across the left shoulder, and his hands were dark to the wrist. He had no change of clothes. He was now 40 minutes late. He sat in the truck for a moment, looked at himself in the rearview mirror, and made a decision that was not really a decision at all. It was just who he was. He drove to the Union Hall anyway. The lobby hit him like a wall of sound and light. Crystal chandeliers, the kind of floral arrangements that cost more than a transmission rebuild. Guests in evening wear moving through the space with the practiced ease of people who had attended enough of these events to be bored by them. A string quartet in the corner playing something that nobody was listening to. Bennett gave his name at the entrance. The young woman at the check-in table found it on the list, handed him a printed card, and directed him toward the VIP section, with a smile that flickered only slightly when she noticed the state of his jacket. He made it about 10 feet past the entrance before the room started noticing it. It wasn't dramatic. It was quieter than that. A ripple of redirected attention, a few murmured exchanges behind champagne flutes, a man in a charcoal suit who looked at Bennett's boots and then looked deliberately away. Someone near the bar laughed at something, and Bennett couldn't be certain it wasn't about him. And that uncertainty was its own particular kind of weight. Dorian Sutter appeared at Serena's elbow before Bennett reached the center of the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "The man in the work jacket," Dorian said, keeping his eyes on the crowd. "He's been in the VIP corridor for 2 minutes. 3 photographers are in the room right now. One of them already looked twice." Serena followed his eyeline. She took in the jacket, the boots, the jacket's ruined shoulder. She took in the way a cluster of guests near the display arch had shifted their attention from the Mercury Cougar to the man who looked like he'd crawled out from under it. She made her assessment in under 5 seconds. She had made faster assessments about harder things. "Handle it," she said. Dorian was already moving. He intercepted Bennett 6 feet from the VIP rope, smooth and quiet. The practiced obstruction of a man who had removed inconvenient people from important rooms for 2 decades. "Sir," he said, positioning himself just slightly in the path, "this section is reserved for confirmed guests. Can I point you toward—" "I'm a confirmed guest," Bennett said. He held up the card. He wasn't angry. His voice was level, in the way that very calm people's voices are level. Dorian glanced at the card without taking it. "There may have been a mix-up. Why don't we step over to the— My car is in that room." Bennett nodded toward the display arch. "The Mercury Cougar. I built it. I was invited here because of it." A beat of silence. Dorian looked at him, really looked the way people look when they're calculating rather than seeing, and made his own assessment. Before he could respond, Serena was there. She had crossed the room in the time it took the exchange to stall. She was composed, her voice pitched low enough that only the 3 of them and perhaps one nearby couple could hear. "Sir," she said, and the word landed with a particular precision. Do you understand that this is a private VIP event? This area is for invited guests and authorized personnel only. I know, Bennett said. I'm an invited guest. Then you'll understand why I'm asking you to confirm that with our event coordinator before. I already confirmed it at the entrance. He held out the printed card. My name is on your list, Bennett Raines. Serena didn't take the card. In the years that followed, she would turn that moment over more times than she could count. She would ask herself what she actually believed in those 5 seconds, whether she truly thought he was lying, or whether she simply couldn't reconcile what she saw in front of her with what the room was supposed to look like that night. She would not arrive at an answer that made her comfortable. What she did was look at the ruined jacket, look at the room full of people who were watching, and make the easier choice. I'm going to need you to step back from this area, she said. Someone from our team will look into the invitation and follow up with you. Bennett was quiet for a moment. He looked at the room, the photographers, the guests, the faces arranged in various expressions of attention and amusement. Then he looked at the Mercury Cougar, visible through the arch, sitting under a warm spotlight that caught every polished surface he'd spent 3 years perfecting. He set the invitation card on the counter. The car deserves to be here, he said quietly, even if I don't. He turned and walked toward the exit without looking back. Serena watched him go. She felt something that she identified briefly as relief. It would be a long time before she understood what it actually was. The program resumed without interruption. That was the thing that struck a handful of guests afterward when they talked about the evening among themselves, how quickly the room reabsorbed the moment. Bennett Raines walked out. The conversation shifted back to champagne and deal-making, and within 90 seconds, it was as if he had never been there at all. The Mercury Cougar stood under its spotlight in the display arch, chrome gleaming, engine silent, and nobody standing near it knew the name of the man who had rebuilt it from a seized block and 3 years of late nights. Serena took the stage 12 minutes later. She was good at this part. She knew how to hold a room, when to slow down, when to let a beat of silence do the work, when to let conviction carry the sentence home. She spoke about legacy and innovation, about the Cade family's roots in mechanical craft and its vision for the electric future. She said the right things in the right order, and the room responded the way rooms did when they were well managed. But something was off in the production. A lighting cue misfired during the Aurora reveal, throwing the wrong color on the car for approximately 4 seconds before the technician corrected it. A small thing, the kind of thing only the event team noticed. Except Dorian noticed, and Dorian's jaw tightened, and he made a note. And then, during the short demo run, the Aurora rolling slowly across the venue floor, while the display screen showed performance data, one of the senior technicians caught a sound, a faint harmonic vibration from somewhere in the drivetrain. He didn't say anything. He made a note in his phone and told himself it was probably resonance from the venue floor. He was not confident that it was resonance from the venue floor. Bennett sat in his truck in the parking structure for longer than he intended. He wasn't the kind of man who let things fester. He'd learned the hard way that sitting inside an emotion too long was a waste of time that could be spent doing something useful. But he sat there anyway, in the dark of the parking structure, and he let himself feel the weight of the evening for a few minutes before he put it down. He called Lena at 8:22 p.m. She picked up on the second ring. How's the car? Not how are you? Not how was the party? The car. Because she knew her father, and she knew that the car was the part that mattered to him, and she asked about the part that mattered. It looked good, he said. Good lighting. Did people stop to look at it? Some. A pause. Did you get to see them looking? Bennett was quiet for a moment. Outside the truck window, a group of guests in evening wear crossed the parking structure toward a waiting car service, laughing about something. Maybe not tonight, he said. Lena didn't push. She was 9, but she understood the shape of that answer. She said, "I left the kitchen light on. There's soup on the stove. Don't forget to turn the burner off. You forgot last time." I didn't forget. I was letting it stay warm. You were forgetting. He almost smiled. "Go to sleep, Lena." "I'm already in bed," she said, which was almost certainly not true. He hung up, started the truck, and sat for one more moment looking at the entrance to the Union Hall through the windshield. Then he reached for the ignition. He didn't leave. He didn't fully understand why later. Maybe it was the car. Maybe it was something he'd heard in the faint vibration from the Aurora during the demo run, just a half-second of sound that crossed the room and lodged somewhere in the part of his brain that cataloged mechanical anomalies without being asked. Whatever it was, he stayed. Gideon Cade arrived at 8:47 p.m. His driver pulled up to the side entrance, and Gideon came through the door slowly, the way he'd been moving since the second procedure. Careful, deliberate, conserving something. He was still a large presence in a room, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with a face that had been weathered by decades of actual work before it had ever been weathered by boardrooms. People moved out of his way, not because he demanded it, but because he carried the gravity of someone who had built the thing they were all standing inside. He moved through the lobby without stopping, nodding to the faces that turned toward him, until he reached the display section near the entrance to the main hall. He stopped at the check-in counter. The printed invitation card was still there. Someone had moved it to the edge of the counter, but hadn't discarded it. Gideon looked at it for a moment, without touching it, the way a person looks at something they weren't expecting to see. Then he picked it up. Bennett Raines. The color left his face in a way that had nothing to do with his heart condition. He stood very still for approximately 4 seconds. Then he turned to the nearest event staff member and said in a voice that was quiet and completely unambiguous, "Where is this man?" The staff member looked uncertain. "I believe Mr. Raines there was a situation earlier, Mr. Cade. Ms. Cade made the decision to—" "Where is he right now?" Dorian had materialized by then, as he always did when Gideon's voice took that particular tone. He delivered the information efficiently. There had been a concern about an unauthorized individual in the VIP section. Serena had addressed it. The gentleman had been asked to leave. The situation had been resolved cleanly. Gideon looked at Dorian for a long moment. "Find him," he said. "Right now. If he's still in the building, you bring him back into this room. If he's in the parking structure, you send someone out there. If he's already on the highway, you call him." He held up the card. "His name is on this list for a reason. My reason." Dorian turned and moved. They found Bennett in the parking structure, truck running about to pull out of the space. He came back into the Union Hall with no particular expression on his face, still in the stained jacket, still in the work boots, invitation card now back in his hand. The room had thinned slightly. Some guests had migrated to the adjoining reception space, but there were still enough people in the main hall to constitute an audience. Gideon came down off the stage platform when he saw Bennett walk through the doors. Not quickly, his body didn't allow for quick anymore, but with a steadiness that made the movement feel like more than movement. He crossed the floor of the Union Hall while the people nearby went quiet, and when he reached Bennett, he put both arms around him, the way you hold someone you thought you'd never see again. Bennett stood very still for a moment. Then he returned it. Gideon stepped back and looked at him. His eyes were wet. He didn't try to hide it. 10 years, Gideon said. 10 years, Bennett said. Gideon turned to face the room. He didn't reach for a microphone. He didn't need one. 10 years ago, he said, I went off a temporary bridge on North Brake Road in a flash flood. Water was coming in through the door seals. My phone was dead. The car was going under. He paused. This man was driving a parts delivery truck in the opposite direction. He didn't know me. He stopped anyway. He tied a tow line to his truck, broke the window glass with his bare hands, and pulled me out before the car went into the water." Another pause, shorter. "He turned down every dollar I tried to give him. He said—" Gideon's voice caught slightly. He cleared it. "He said if it were his daughter in that car, he'd hope someone would stop." The hall was silent. Serena stood at the edge of the stage platform and felt something she could not immediately name move through her chest like a current. The man she had removed from her event, the man she had looked at and seen a problem, had saved her father's life. She had no framework for this. Every system she used to organize the world had just failed simultaneously. Serena came to the garage 3 days later. She drove herself, which she almost never did in the city, and she came alone, which she never did for anything that felt like official business. She told herself it wasn't official business. She wasn't entirely sure what it was. Raines Craft and Motorworks looked exactly like what it was. A working garage at the edge of a working town. Nothing decorative about it, nothing performed. The roll-up door was open. A country station played from somewhere inside. A truck with a cracked taillight was up on the lift, and Bennett was underneath it, doing something to the exhaust system with focused, unhurried movements. Serena stood at the edge of the open door for a moment before he heard her. "Mr. Raines!" He rolled out from under the truck on a creeper, looked up at her, and said nothing. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look particularly pleased. He looked at her the way you look at weather you've been expecting but haven't decided how to feel about yet. He stood up, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and waited. "I owe you an apology," she said. "A real one, not the version I drafted with Dorian's help." She paused. "I looked at you and made a decision about who you were in about 4 seconds. I was wrong, and I was public about being wrong, and I'm sorry." Bennett looked at her for a moment. He wasn't cold about it. He wasn't warm either. "I appreciate that," he said. "I do." He folded the shop rag and set it on the workbench. "But an apology doesn't change what you saw when you looked at me. It doesn't change the fact that you looked at a room full of people waiting for me to be humiliated and decided to give them what they came for." Serena didn't flinch. She'd prepared for pushback, but not for that specific version of it, the one that was entirely accurate and delivered without cruelty. "No," she said. "It doesn't." "So I'll accept the apology," Bennett said. "I'm just not going to pretend it fixes everything because that wouldn't be honest, and you've had enough people being dishonest with you." She stayed for 40 minutes that first day. They didn't talk the whole time. At some point, she sat down on a metal stool near the workbench and watched him finish the exhaust repair. And the silence was not uncomfortable in the way she'd expected it to be. It was more like the silence of a room where real things were allowed to exist. She came back the following week, and the week after that. She told herself the first return visit was about making things right. By the third, she had stopped explaining it to herself at all. The garage was unlike any environment she inhabited professionally. Nothing in it was designed to impress. The equipment was well maintained, but old. The walls had a board where Bennett pinned notes, parts diagrams, hand-drawn sketches of engine configurations. There was a coffee maker on the shelf that had seen better years and produced excellent coffee, which struck Serena as a Bennett Raines quality in miniature. She watched him work. She watched the way he moved around the garage with the unhurried certainty of someone who had done the same things 10,000 times and still took them seriously. She watched the way he treated the cars, not like objects to be processed, but like things that had histories worth respecting. She noticed that he always explained what he was doing, even when no one asked. Not for show, just because it seemed to him like the right way to work around other people. It was on her 4th visit that she found out about the invoices. She was looking for a pen on the workbench. Bennett was on a call outside, and she opened the wrong drawer. Inside was a folder of completed work orders neatly organized. She wasn't snooping. She pushed the drawer closed and then stopped because the top invoice was visible, and the line that read "Total Due" had been crossed out and replaced in Bennett's handwriting with 2 words: paid in full. She opened the drawer again. She looked through the folder. 12 invoices in the last 4 months, all for substantial repairs. A transmission replacement, a full brake overhaul, a head gasket job, all marked the same way. The customer names were Harborvale, addresses she vaguely recognized as being on the lower end of the county's income map. When Bennett came back inside, she was still standing at the workbench. "These invoices," she said. He glanced at the folder. His expression didn't change. "Those are closed out. They're marked paid in full, but the payment column is empty." "They're closed out," he said again. "Bennett," she turned to face him, "you did $1,200 of free work last month." "I did work that needed to be done," he said. "The billing is my business. Why mark them paid? Why not just write it off as pro bono?" He was quiet for a moment. He took the folder, closed it, put it back in the drawer. "Because if I write pro bono, they know I felt sorry for them," he said. "If I write paid, they just think they got a good price. One of those things lets them leave with their head up." He closed the drawer. "People don't need more weight to carry." Serena stood with that for a moment. She had run 2 corporate philanthropic programs and sat on the board of a regional housing nonprofit. She had approved 6-figure donation packages and attended ribbon-cutting ceremonies and been photographed handing over checks. She had done good things, real things. But she had never once thought about whether the way she gave something might be adding weight to the person receiving it. The afternoon Lena met Serena properly was a Thursday, 3 weeks into the visits. Bennett was under the Mercury Cougar doing a post-event inspection, and Lena was at her folding table near the window, ostensibly doing homework, but visibly not. She had been watching Serena since she walked in. Serena was examining the parts diagram on the wall when Lena spoke. "You're the one who kicked my dad out of the party." It wasn't a question. Serena turned around. Lena was looking at her with the particular expression of a 9-year-old who has decided to have a conversation and has no intention of softening it. "Yes," Serena said, "I am." "He didn't tell me," Lena said. "I figured it out." She looked down at her notebook, then back up. "He came home late that night, and his eyes were red. He said it was the drive. But he always drives that road, and his eyes are never red." Serena didn't have an answer for that. There wasn't one. "I'm sorry," she said. "That was my fault, and I handled it badly, and your dad didn't deserve it." Lena considered this with the gravity of a judge reviewing new evidence. Then she said, "Okay," and looked back down at her homework as though the matter had been entered into the record and filed. From under the car, Bennett said nothing, but the work he was doing slowed for just a moment and then resumed. Dorian, meanwhile, had not been idle. He watched Serena's visits to the garage with careful, sustained attention. He had spent 22 years building the Cade Mobility brand into something coherent and controlled, and coherence required predictability, and Serena's behavior in recent weeks was not predictable. He began quietly. A word here, a planted observation there. He mentioned to 2 board members in separate conversations framed as concern rather than criticism that Serena seemed to be spending considerable personal time with someone who had no formal relationship to the company. He described Bennett neutrally, a local mechanic, a restoration specialist, someone Gideon had a personal history with, and let the implication do the work that a direct accusation couldn't. He wasn't lying exactly. He was arranging true things in a shape that produced a false picture. He told himself he was protecting the company. But underneath that, if he was honest, and Dorian rarely was with himself, he was protecting the world he understood. The one where image was substance, where presentation was truth, where a man in a stained jacket had no business being in the room. If that world turned out to be wrong, then the 2 decades he'd spent building it had been spent on something hollow. And Dorian Sutter was not prepared to believe that. Bennett wasn't supposed to be in the technical bay that Wednesday. He'd come to the Cade Mobility facility on the east side of the city as an independent consultant, a loose arrangement Gideon had quietly set up. 3 days a month, no title, no contract beyond a handshake, and a rate that Bennett had tried to negotiate down and Gideon had refused to move on. The arrangement gave Bennett full access to the facility floor during his visits. He came in, walked where the work was, looked at things, said what he thought. Nobody was obligated to listen. Most of the engineering team didn't. He was passing through the technical bay on his way to the parts archive when he heard it. A faint harmonic vibration coming from the Aurora prototype during a low-speed systems check. It lasted less than 2 seconds. The 2 technicians running the check didn't react. Either they hadn't heard it or they'd logged it and moved on. Bennett stopped walking. He stood at the edge of the bay for a moment, head slightly tilted, the way he stood when something in an engine was trying to tell him something. Then he walked over to the nearest technician and asked if he could look at the moisture sensor data from the last 3 road tests. The technician looked at him with polite caution. "I'd need sign-off from the systems lead," she said. "That's fine," Bennett said. "Who's the systems lead?" The systems lead was a 44-year-old engineer named Patrick Aurora, who had a PhD from Carnegie Mellon, 14 years in EV drivetrain development, and a specific, well-practiced expression for people who questioned his team's work without credentials he recognized. He gave Bennett that expression when Bennett came to his office and explained what he'd heard. "The Aurora has been through 400 hours of systems testing," Aurora said. "Our brake regen algorithm is within spec on every wet surface scenario we've modeled." "I'm not questioning your testing," Bennett said. "I'm asking about a specific data gap. The moisture sensor, where is it positioned relative to the brake modulator?" Aurora told him. Bennett was quiet for a moment. "That's a 17-inch signal path. What's your latency tolerance on the brake regen response?" 0.4 seconds. "And the sensor refresh rate in high humidity conditions?" A pause, shorter than it should have been. "That's within our operational parameters." "I know it's within your parameters," Bennett said. "I'm asking what it actually runs at." Oral's expression shifted from polished dismissal to something less comfortable. "I'll have my team review the data," he said, which was not an answer to the question. Bennett left the office without pushing further. He wrote up what he'd observed, 2 pages handwritten specific, and brought it to Serena that afternoon. She read it at her desk while he sat across from her. When she finished, she set it down and was quiet for a moment. "You think the brake regen has a wet surface latency problem?" she said. "I think there's a gap between what the sensor is reporting and when the modulator acts on it in high humidity conditions. I think that gap is small enough to pass every controlled test and under 8 minutes of exposure, and large enough to cause a loss of control event on a wet public road at highway deceleration speeds. Patrick's team has cleared the system 4 times. Patrick's team modeled the scenarios. I'm telling you what I heard." He leaned forward slightly. "Serena, the car is going to be driven by real people on real roads in rain. If I'm wrong, you've lost a day of testing. If I'm right, and you don't check, you're looking at a recall at best and a fatality at worst." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Aurora. The conversation did not go well. Aurora was measured but immovable. The system had been certified. The testing was documented. The suggestion that a restoration mechanic, his phrasing delivered with the precision of someone who had chosen it carefully, had identified a flaw that 4 rounds of professional engineering review had missed, was not something he was prepared to accept. He recommended that Bennett's facility access be reviewed. Dorian heard about the conversation within the hour. The video surfaced on a Wednesday evening. It had been shot during a wet road test 3 weeks earlier. Internal footage from a track facility, the kind of thing that lived on a shared drive and was never supposed to leave it. 12 seconds long. The Aurora coming through a curve on a wet surface, the rear stepping out sharply, the car skating toward the barrier before the driver caught it and brought it back. No one could say with certainty how it got out. The file had been accessed by 11 people in the weeks before it surfaced, and Dorian's name was on that list, alongside 9 engineers and Aurora himself. The leak was never formally attributed. What mattered was where it landed in the inboxes of 4 board members, 2 major investors, and a journalist at an automotive trade publication who had called the company's press line for comment. By Thursday morning, Dorian was in Serena's office. The working theory in the building, he said, is that Raines accessed the prototype during his consultation visits and introduced a variable that affected the sensor calibration. There's no proof of that, but there's no proof it didn't happen either. And right now, that ambiguity is sitting in the middle of a story that is going to run whether we manage it or not. Serena looked at him. That's not a theory. That's a narrative you're constructing. I'm telling you what people are saying. You're telling me what you want people to believe. Dorian's expression didn't change. The board wants a statement by end of day. They want Bennett Raines removed from all facility access and all company activities effective immediately. They want it done before the journalist publishes. And if I don't, then the story isn't about a possible brake system flaw. The story is about the CEO who compromised her company's safety certification process by giving unsupervised facility access to an unvetted outside contractor with a personal connection to her family. He paused. That's the story, Serena, whether it's true or not. The room was very quiet. Serena stood at the window that looked out over the facility floor. She could see the Aurora prototype in the technical bay below, still and silver under the work lights. She thought about Bennett sitting across from her desk the day before, 2 pages of handwritten notes on the table between them, saying, "If I'm wrong, you've lost a day. If I'm right, and you don't check." She thought about Lena, 9 years old, at a folding table, saying, "His eyes were red, and he said it was the drive." She thought about the people currently employed by this company, and the investors who had trusted her with their money, and the customers who were going to put their families in that car. She thought about all of it. And then she thought about what kind of person she was going to be when this was over. "Get me Patrick Aurora," she said, "and get me the raw sensor data from every wet road test we've run in the last 6 months. All of it. Tonight." Dorian looked at her for a moment. "Serena." "Tonight, Dorian." The board meeting was called for Friday morning at 7. Serena had not slept. She'd spent Thursday night in the facility's data room with 2 junior engineers who were young enough to still be uncomfortable defying their system's lead and experienced enough to know what they were looking at when the numbers were laid out in front of them. By 2 a.m., they had what they needed. By 4 a.m., Serena had made her decision. By 6 a.m., she was dressed at her desk and ready. She called Bennett at 6:15. "I need you at the facility at 9, she said. "Bring whatever you need to walk a room full of engineers through a sensor latency problem in plain language." A pause. "You looked at the raw data." "All of it. You were right. The refresh rate under sustained humidity runs at 0.62 seconds in real conditions. The modulator tolerance is 0.4. There's a 0.22 second gap that only opens up after 8+ minutes of wet road exposure. Every controlled test they ran was under 8 minutes. "I'll be there at 9, he said. The board meeting did not go the way Dorian had planned. He had prepared for a session in which Serena managed optics, distanced herself from Bennett, accepted the board's recommendation, issued a statement that reframed the leaked video as evidence of rigorous internal testing rather than a product failure, and moved forward. It was a clean play. He had run versions of it before. Instead, Serena walked into the boardroom, set a 40-page data printout on the table, and started talking. She did not manage the optics. She described the problem in technical terms, sourced entirely from her own engineering team's data. She described the sequence of events: Bennett's observation, his written report, Aurora's dismissal, the leaked video, Dorian's recommendation. She did not editorialize. She did not assign blame beyond what the record supported. She simply laid out what had happened, in the order it had happened, and let the board sit with it. Then she said, I ignored a valid safety warning for approximately 36 hours because the person who delivered it didn't have the credentials my team recognized. That decision was mine. The consequences of it, the leaked video, the investor concern, the press inquiry, are a direct result of that delay. I'm not here to ask you to protect me from those consequences. I'm here to tell you that the correct next step is to fix the car. And the person who can help us do that fastest is Bennett Raines. One of the senior board members looked at the data printout, looked at Serena and said, "Show me the sensor position diagram." That was the turning point. Bennett arrived at 9 with nothing but a notepad and his 2 pages of handwritten observations. He walked into the technical bay, not the boardroom, because that was where the work was. Aurora was already there. The two men looked at each other with the particular quality of attention that exists between people who have been on opposite sides of a professional disagreement and are now, reluctantly, on the same side of a problem. The gap is real, Bennett said, not as an accusation, as a starting point. Aurora was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled up the data on the bay monitor and said, "Walk me through what you heard." What followed was 4 hours of work that neither man would fully describe to anyone afterward. It had the quality of a conversation conducted entirely in the language of systems and tolerances and calibration sequences, 2 people who understood machines differently, arriving by separate routes at the same place. The fix was not simple, but it was not catastrophic. The moisture sensor cluster needed to be repositioned, moved from the chassis midpoint to a location 12 inches closer to the rear wheel assembly, reducing the signal path and bringing the real-world latency below the modulator's tolerance threshold. The regen algorithm needed a secondary humidity input from the repositioned sensor to eliminate the 8-minute exposure lag. The changes required 4 days of retesting under sustained wet road conditions before anyone could certify them. Bennett wrote the repositioning specification by hand on 3 pages of the facility's engineering notepad. He handed it to the technician who had first looked at him with careful reserve 3 weeks earlier. She read it, looked up, and said, "This is Queen." "Test it," he said. "Don't take my word for it." She tested it. 4 days later, the Aurora passed every wet road scenario on the testing calendar, including 6 that Aural's team designed specifically to probe the latency gap. The 0.22-second window was gone. The rear-end instability in the leaked video was not reproducible. The journalist at the trade publication ran a different story than the one Dorian had feared. Not a cover-up piece, but a reported account of how an outside consultant had identified a calibration flaw that internal testing had missed, and how the company had corrected it before launch. It was not a flattering story. It was an honest one. Dorian was called into Gideon's office on the 5th day. Gideon did not raise his voice. He sat behind his desk with the engineering report and Dorian's internal communications printed out side by side, and he looked at Dorian for a long moment before he spoke. "You built something real," Gideon said. "The brand, the story, the way this company presents itself, that's yours. I mean that." He paused. "But somewhere along the way, you started believing the presentation was the thing itself, that protecting the image was the same as protecting the company." He set the papers down. "You were willing to let a safety flaw go to market to protect a story. That's not communications work. That's something else." Dorian sat very still. "I'm not going to let you go," Gideon said. "You've earned more than that. But you're going to spend the next 6 months reviewing every external narrative we've built and telling me honestly which parts of it are true and which parts are construction. And you're going to do that because if you can't tell the difference anymore, you're not useful to me." Dorian left the office without speaking. In the hallway outside, he stood for a moment with his hand still on the door handle. Then he walked to the elevator. It was the quietest he'd been in 22 years. The relaunch event was held 3 weeks later at the same Union Hall, without the chandeliers. Serena had requested a different setup, work lights the Aurora on a plain platform, no string quartet. The guest list was smaller. The press list was unchanged. She did not have a prepared speech. She stood at the front of the room and said what had happened in the same order she had told the board. And then she said, "I want to acknowledge something publicly that I should have understood from the beginning." She looked at Bennett, who was standing near the back wall with his arms folded, wearing the same canvas jacket. 3 weeks ago, I removed this man from this building because of what he looked like. That decision reflected a set of assumptions I held about who belongs in what room. And those assumptions were wrong. He identified a problem that could have put people in danger. I almost didn't listen because I'd already decided what kind of person he was. She paused. I was wrong. I am saying that now in public, the same way I was wrong about it in public. Bennett looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up. Gideon, standing to the left of the platform, said, "Technology moves a company forward. Character determines whether it deserves to go." The room was quiet in a way that was different from the quiet of managed events. It was the quiet of people sitting with something true. The North Break Fund was announced quietly. No press release, no campaign, no photography of Serena handing an oversized check to someone whose gratitude could be captured at the right angle. Just a page on the Cade Mobility website, 4 paragraphs, an application form, and a phone number that rang to a real person. The fund covered vehicle repair costs for families below a certain income threshold in Harborvale and the 4 surrounding counties, transmission work, brake jobs, safety inspections, anything that kept a car roadworthy enough to get someone to work, get a child to school, get an elderly parent to a medical appointment. The name came from the road where Gideon's car had gone into the water 10 years earlier. Serena had chosen it without consulting anyone. When Gideon saw it, he didn't say anything. He just nodded once, the way he nodded when something was right. Bennett found out about the fund the same way most Harborvale residents did. Someone mentioned it at the diner on Clement Street. He drove past the garage that evening without stopping, thinking about it. The next morning, he called the fund's intake coordinator and offered to be a preferred repair provider at cost. He didn't ask for recognition. He asked about the intake process and whether families were required to provide documentation of hardship. The coordinator said yes. Currently, they were required to provide documentation. Bennett said, "You might want to reconsider that. The people who need it most are usually the ones least likely to have paperwork in order." The coordinator made a note. 2 weeks later, the documentation requirement was revised. He turned down everything Gideon offered him. The title, Director of Mechanical Integrity, a newly created position with a salary that would have changed his life materially. He declined in a single phone call. The equity stake Gideon proposed declined in writing, politely, with a note that said he appreciated the gesture, but it wasn't what he was there for. What he accepted was the original arrangement. 3 days a month, independent consultant, no title. He came in, walked the floor, said what he thought, and went home. The engineering team had shifted after the Aurora correction. Oral in particular had changed in a way that was subtle and permanent. He didn't become warm exactly, but he became honest, which was more useful. He started sending Bennett calibration queries by email between visits. Bennett answered them when he could. He never billed for the time. Lena turned 10 2 months after the relaunch. She had requested specifically that her birthday involve no restaurant, no party venue, and no occasion for anyone to dress up. What she wanted was to stay at the garage, order pizza, and work on the '72 Chevelle that Bennett had acquired in pieces from an estate sale and was planning to restore over the next 2 years. She had decided the Chevelle was partially hers, a claim she had established by being present when it arrived and immediately identifying correctly. That the passenger door had been replaced at some point with a door from a different trim level. "The chrome strip is wrong," she'd said the day it came off the trailer. "It's a different gauge." Bennett had looked at it. "You're right." Lena had nodded as though this confirmed something she'd already known about herself. On her birthday, she worked the driver's side door panel with a trim removal tool, while Bennett walked her through the process of not cracking a 50-year-old plastic clip. Serena sat on the metal stool near the workbench, eating pizza, watching the two of them argue, in the specific register of people who know each other well enough to disagree productively. "You're going too fast," Bennett said. "I'm going the right speed." "The clip is going to break."
"It's not going to—"
The clip broke. Lena looked at it. That was the clip's fault. "Sure," Bennett said. Serena laughed before she could stop herself. Lena turned and looked at her with the expression of someone who had not been expecting an audience for that particular moment. Then, after a beat, the corner of her mouth moved. "There's more pizza," Lena said, which was the closest she came to an invitation. Serena took another slice. It was a Thursday evening in late October when Serena stayed later than she'd planned. She hadn't meant to. She had a call at 8, a board prep document to finish, a full calendar the next morning. But Bennett had put on a record, something old, a needle drop kind of sound that filled the garage with the particular warmth of music played on equipment that required patience, and she'd found herself not leaving. They were talking about nothing important. The Chevelle's brake lines, a funny thing Lena had said at school. The way the light came through the garage's high windows in the fall, at a specific angle that made the Mercury Cougar's hood look like it was lit from inside. At some point the conversation ran out the way good conversations do not, because there was nothing left, but because the silence that followed it was the same temperature as the conversation itself, and there was no reason to fill it. Bennett was at the workbench. Serena was sitting on the stool with her jacket across her knees, not going anywhere. He looked over at her. She looked back. He moved one of the parts trays along the bench, making room, and angled his head slightly, a question without words. She put her jacket on the hook by the door and stayed. The Mercury Cougar won its class at the Harborvale Summer Show the following June. The show was held in the fairgrounds parking lot between a funnel cake stand and a display of vintage farm equipment. There was no red carpet. There were people who knew what they were looking at, standing in the sun with their hands in their pockets, circling the car slowly, the way you circle something you respect. Lena hung the ribbon on the garage wall herself, using 2 pieces of tape and a level she'd borrowed from the toolbox, because she'd decided it needed to be straight. She stepped back, adjusted it twice, and was satisfied. Then she turned to Serena. "Do you know how to use a torque wrench?" Lena asked. "No," Serena said. Lena nodded, considering. "Dad should teach you. It's not hard." She said it the way she said most things, as a statement of fact, not an offer, not a question. As though the future she was describing was simply the one that made the most sense. Then she walked back to the Chevelle and picked up where she'd left off. Bennett stood near the Mercury Cougar with his hands in his pockets, looking at the ribbon on the wall, at the car under the afternoon light, at the garage that smelled like oil and cold coffee, and whatever Lena had brought for lunch. He didn't need the world to find him. He'd never needed that. But here in this room, with the light coming in at the right angle, and his daughter's voice carrying across the floor, and the quiet sound of someone staying, he had everything he'd been building toward. It had just taken the world a little while to learn how to look. There's something worth sitting with at the end of a story like this. Bennett never tried to prove himself. He just kept being exactly who he was, quietly, consistently, without needing anyone to notice. He fixed the bus because kids needed to get home. He marked invoices paid because people don't need more weight to carry. He walked away from the gala without making a scene, not because he had nothing to say, but because his dignity wasn't something the room could take from him. Most of us have been in a version of that room at some point. Somewhere we didn't look the part. Somewhere someone made a fast decision about us based on what we were wearing, or what we drove, or where we came from. And most of us know how it feels to walk out of that room carrying something heavy. What Bennett understood, and what Serena had to learn the hard way, is that character isn't what you perform in the right rooms. It's what you do on a dark shoulder of the road when nobody's watching and there's no upside to stopping. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing. Every week there are more stories like this one about ordinary people doing quietly extraordinary things. And what happens when the world finally pays attention? It only takes a second, and it means we get to keep making them. Thanks for listening.